For somebody disconnected from the Tales of series, it might be hard to get an agreed-upon recommendation for a welcoming starting point to the series. Even casual searches bring forth all kinds of hot takes and petty dismissals of other people's favorite or even their own claim to a quote-unquote definitive Tales title, which seems a little silly given how they operate similarly to Final Fantasy and that there truly isn't a definitive title. Their takes on an established formula, iterating in some areas, maintaining the staples, the commonalities recognizable in most titles, and experimenting in other areas, distinguishing each entry enough to construct allegiances to particular titles and utter disdain for others. Vesperia is my first true introduction to this series. I don't have the luxury of comparative analysis, but perhaps I do have the freedom of unconstrained experience with this title, a newcomer's eyes, so to speak. While this has undoubtedly been true for other titles I've reviewed, I thought it was important to clarify here. Vesperia was initially released as an Xbox 360 exclusive in 2008, then a port to the PS3 that was exclusive to Japan with tons of additions, containing almost double the voice work of the original script, making Flynn a playable character and adding Patty. The remastered version of Vesperia, called the Definitive Edition, which is the way I experienced it, includes all of the PS3 content, upscaled graphics, paid DLC from the PS3 version was also included for free, and English and Japanese voice tracks, despite not bringing back Troy Baker to reprise his role as the main character, Yuri Lowell, for the additional voice segments from the PS3 version, which led to a replacement, Grant George, voicing him, who does a mostly fine job at making the inconsistency not so glaringly obvious, but it's still there and hard to get over once recognized. As a quick aside, Troy Baker has done several interviews about not only the unique and rare process of voicing Yuri, as he was basically able to make subtle adjustments according to how he and the team, and this included Yoshito Higuchi, the director of the game, interpreted what a typical Yuri action might be in a given scenario, and the massive length of the script, which was about 4 binders early on. He also comments on how amusing it is that Yuri Lowenthal, having just voiced Ash and Luke from Tales of the Abyss and a sought-after and accomplished voice actor, didn't get to voice his namesake in the next game. Anyway, I'd recommend reading the interviews as they add a great deal of insight into voice acting in general and how it was uniquely approached in Vesperia specifically. The game starts with Yuri Lowell, a former Imperial Knight, going on a mission to reclaim a Blastia core, which are energy sources in the world of Turcalumeris and are powered by the mystical substance known as air. Blastia are used for protection in major cities and can also provide all kinds of resources, such as the aforementioned Aqua Blastia, which produces clean and pure water. There are also barrier Blastias, which prevent monsters from entering a town. Yuri slowly encounters a varied and complicated cast as his task blossoms into a full-blown mission to save the world. Vesperia hits the player with a deluge of cornball dad jokes and slapstick humor, quickly and comically establishing the party dynamic and cementing baseline characterizations, from Yuri's sardonic wit to Carol's waffling in the face of danger to Rita's physical abuses and constant yelling, and Raven's role as the butt of every old man joke in the game. These character exchanges are crucial for much of the early game, as its pacing is undoubtedly a bit of a slow burn, taking its time to establish major players, hierarchies, its institutions, and much of the early and influential conflicts, as well as cleverly masking some of the later revelations. It is a well thought out world and history. The character interactions, expanded upon by skits, which are brief, fully voiced optional character conversations with portraits representing the characters and chock full of personality, which is an impressive feat given the comparatively bare-bones presentation, are mostly enjoyable, even if by 40 plus hours in, they can get a bit fatiguing. I'll say this as delicately as I can, because to be honest, taken individually, the skits are superb, and Rita bopping Carol on the head is just cheap but fun humor, and the skits help to build the cast as a tight and loving group. But there are simply too many of them. To be hit with a long, intriguing, and exposition-laden cutscene only to be followed up by 2 skits expounding on information that easily could have been a throwaway line or rolled into the cutscene or retreading motivational markers isn't a huge deal the first 5, 6, 10th time it happens. Hell, it can easily be viewed as a smart bit of small-scale world building, but after the 100th time, especially coming right after a party collection moment, wherein the player is tasked with finding every party member scattered throughout a city, with each encounter including a brief scene, is a bit exhausting. They are technically optional, but I doubt many players would elect to skip them given the relative importance many of them can hold. It's unfortunate because, again, taken individually, there's absolutely nothing wrong with them. They're fun, momentary diversions from grinding or dungeon crawling, and often elicit a chuckle or two or forge new bonds. But I found myself almost skipping them by the late game. They're a bit too excessive and have a habit of constantly repeating motives and plans. Outside of its excellent cast, where the game truly shines is its interrogation of a central question that Yuri and Flynn grapple with throughout much of the game, elaborated on in some pretty daring scenes, especially for the actions of a JRPG protagonist. It's the idea of justice and whether systemic change and real shifts of power can ever occur within the confines of a corrupt and poisoned institution. Yuri's constant exposure to the cruelness of the nobility and the evils enacted upon the lower class shaped his Dirty Harry approach, while Flynn, also exposed to these injustices, took a much different, more blindly idealistic approach and elected to seek worthwhile change from within the very apparatus that enabled, and often protected, the abuse. This not only highlights how different people emerge from great environmental stressors and abusive systems as very different people with uniquely distinguished approaches, but how and if these seemingly incompatible stances can coexist in the face of an even greater evil or force. It also has one of the best second acts in any video game I've played, completely capitalizing on the slow build of the first act with massive revelations and devastatingly moving scenes. Even if the last third of the game felt less earned and less impressively told, the character development was mostly spot on. From poor Carol's growth from a trembling 12-year-old terrified of failure and helplessness to a brave and heroic leader of his own guild, to Estelle's exposure to everything, and Rita, with a near indefatigable source of self-confidence that shuns emotional connection, finally showing her protective and caring side, even wavering a bit near the end. When the characters are clashing, when the tropes and cliches the base characters are built on are stressed and tested, the game is a blast to experience. Yuri is an endlessly intriguing main character given the history of how JRPG main protagonists typically handle injustices or deeply perverse villains. He takes things into his own hands, refusing to helplessly wait for a wrong to magically right itself or for that perfect moment. He's wonderfully layered, playful but passionate, and certainly flawed. He knows when his friends need less of the harsh and aloof Yuri and more of the calming and deeply engaged Yuri. Even if, as I said earlier, the skits should have been scaled back and the story is inconsistent and a beat or two too long, the adventures with this odd cast are delightful. Vesperia's combat is a melange of many slowly introduced but workable mechanics, even hours into the game, like 20 plus hours into the game, that all eventually, and I cannot stress that word enough, come together to form a fast-paced, chaotic, rewarding dance that feels near perfect for my own desires of what an action-oriented RPG can offer. Vesperia uses a variation of the linear motion battle system, a Tales of trademark, called the Evolved Flex Range Linear Motion Battle System. The player initiates combat by making contact with monsters on the field, and after a snappy transition reminiscent of Final Fantasy X's, you take control of one party member of your choosing. For me, this was almost always Yuri, with the other three being controlled by the AI and your own optional strategies like focus the same enemy or focus on healing. There's also spacing commands for your individual units. Very broad and easy to understand commands, but with a surprising amount of executed precision. You can freely run or stay confined to a fixed axis locked onto a specific enemy, easily rotated through, guard, launch basic attacks, perform all kinds of arts, which are basically your abilities, chain basic attacks to different kinds of arts, initiate a fatal strike on a monster, which is triggered by inflicting enough of one type of damage, either from a kind of art or a normal attack, and these are pretty satisfying to pull off, mind you. You can build up an overlimit, a bar that builds as you attack and get hit, which once activated allows the player to continually attack and perform arts. As you unlock higher overlimit levels, even more opens up to the player. player, from executing arts without consuming TP, to burst arts, which is a powerful art performed after an arcane or altered art, which are given to you by weapons and enhance or modify an existing art, to mystic arts, which are the most powerful arts accessible to a character and have some really cool snappy cutaway scenes as it's performed. You learn skills from equipment, much like Final Fantasy IX, and can access those skills permanently after you've learned them, even without the equipment attached. And there are a load of skills to experiment with that all seem to have some use, even if that might not be all that noticeable until future playthroughs on harder difficulties or against certain bosses or monsters. And make no mistake about it, Vesperia doesn't just invite you to experience it a second time, it actively sets up all kinds of mechanics and systems that really can't be appreciated unless you're going to play it again. The grade shop, for instance, using all of the grade that you've accumulated from your first playthrough, which is what it sounds like. You get grades for executing certain actions in battle and playing on harder difficulties. The grade is banked and allows the player to purchase all kinds of stuff, some that are quite game-altering in fact, at the beginning of your next playthrough. There's also cooking, which is a rather fun and efficient way of maintaining health and TP between encounters, as well as plenty of other various buffs. There's also an absurd amount of easily missable and impossibly obscured side quests, some that have insultingly short windows or that require backtracking to a spot that would make no sense to any sane player. While this is frustrating, it again encourages many playthroughs to experience all of the little nuggets in the world, even if some cool additional character development is easily missed, and that's a bit of a shame. While all of this might appear to be an overwhelming number of working parts and systems to contend with, its introduction is so staggered and timed so well that it really never frustrated me. It just meshes so well, and by the end game, as the player is stringing together base arts, arcane arts, altered arts, and performing all kinds of wild burst and mystic arts while in overlimit and finishing with a fatal strike, it just makes sense and it flows perfectly. Even if you're not even scratching the surface of the system's upper limit, there's a handy battle book to reference if any of its parts confound you or if you simply missed a crucial piece of information. Even synthesizing weapons, which in other games usually requires a great deal of effort to make sure you're finding all the rare materials, is easy and almost never required any painstaking investigation into some hyper-rare component. The most tricky part of it is simply making sure not to sell your weapons, which is a JRPG commonality, so can get a bit tricky there. I mostly stayed tethered to some very simple and reliable combos, only experiencing a bit of New Game Plus in hard mode. I suspect someone very good at utilizing all of its system's offerings would dominate, and I've seen clips of this. That isn't me, but it still felt very rewarding to pull off simple combos into base arts, into arcane arts, and to lock enemies down. There's a lot going on in any given battle, but it never feels visually oppressive. Judith flying by, Rita's spells incinerating a foe to your left, and Estelle's rain of healing arts just complemented my endless barrage of combos on a hapless enemy. It's fiercely addictive. I've said this a few times about other games, but it's a fighting system that even if you have no interest whatsoever in the game's story or its world, you're still going to want to experience. The game also has an excellent soundtrack thanks to Motoi Sakuraba and his regular partner Shinji Tamura. Sakuraba's legacy is an impressive one, having worked on Star Ocean, Golden Sun, most Tales games, Valkyrie Profile, Eternal Sonata, and also contributed to Dark Souls. It's kind of shocking, honestly. The game's theme song was sung by Japanese singer-songwriter Bonnie Pink and was the first theme song in the Tales series to be shared by both Japanese and Western versions. It's a very balanced soundtrack that makes use of Sakuraba's skill as a musician, having played the piano parts, and as a composer. It has some of the most intense boss and encounter music I've ever heard, capitalizing on his own intimacy with the Japanese progressive rock scene of the 1980s. Vesperia's world is a fun one to be immersed in, with knights riding well dragons and pirates flying on chainsaw swords and many interesting quirky inhabitants, but its strength is its wonderfully lovable cast and a fighting system that continues to add pieces late into the game but miraculously sidesteps obfuscation or overburdening the player and encourages experimentation with both skills and arts. I don't know what other Tales of games hold for me, but I can say that Vesperia has convinced me to revisit the series, even if I'm a little worried that none can live up to this excellent introduction.